Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. The main focus of this one is the Luhansk-Kharkiv region here in the east by the Uskil river line. We can split this section of the front line into four separate parts. We have the southern parts along the Serbets river line west of Kreminna, east of Liman. This section of the front line is where a lot of soldiers is concentrated on both the Russian and Ukrainian side. The Russians have three parts of concentration for their soldiers. The main part is Kreminna, then we have Svatove further north, and the northern parts near the Russian border to Ukraine. These three parts is where the main force of the Russian soldiers are. And the main force of those three is the Kreminna one. Similarly, the Ukrainians have three separate areas. They have Liman in the south, Borova in the center, and Kupiansk in the north. The main force of the Ukrainians is in Liman to the south, and we see that the concentration of forces of both sides match the distance between the Usk river line to the Russian section of the front line. So the further north you go, the smaller a concentration of forces there are, and the southern parts along the Usk river line and by Liman is the longest part, and therefore also the part with the largest concentration of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers. Yet we can split this section of the front line into four parts. The first part is in the south in the Kreminna direction between Kreminna and Liman, where along the Serbets river line from Stelmakhivka and down south to Torske in between Liman and Kreminna is one of these sections. This is the section where the most heavy fighting is taking place in the Serbianki forest area by the Serbets river in the eastern parts of it, where the Russians are attempting to align the front line along the Serbets river line. We see a lot of positional fighting west of Stelmakhivka, where the Ukrainians during the summer offensive were attempting to regain control over Stelmakhivka and Kreminna. However, the Russians were able to hold back such offensive operations and stabilize the front along the Serbets river line, where fighting takes place now as Russians are attempting to gain control of it to then push towards Liman. The significance of the Serbets river line is that it acts as a flank for the side that gains control of it. This means that the Ukrainians are able to concentrate a lot of their forces along the Serbets river line. Having that as a strong defensive line and position allows them to concentrate a lot of forces to the south in the Serbianki forest area and along the Torske Serbets area, where the Ukrainians are able to have a lot of their forces there, preventing a Russian breakthrough. Similarly, if the Russians were to gain control over the Serbets river line, they would be able to concentrate their forces along the south and an attempt for a breakthrough towards Liman. Getting control over Liman would secure the east of the Usk river line in the southern parts to the Russian side, as they'll be able to push along the entire area, along the Seversky Donetsk river here to the south and up to the Usk river to the north. It will significantly improve the Russian positions in the area, and the Ukrainian positions would significantly deteriorate. And here we see the main fighting takes place along the Terny-Yampolivka direction, where the Ukrainians made a significant push away from Yampolivka, pushing the Russians back several forest lines, and the Russians in the north towards Terny have been pushing the Ukrainians back and have aligned the front line along the outskirts of the village. So we see positional fighting continues here, and in the Serbets river line, a lot of positional fighting and back and forth have been happening for over a year, with heavy casualties and much destruction within the forest area. The second part of this section of the front line is here in between the Serbets river line and the Russian foothold across. This is all the way from Berestove in the north towards Stelmakhivka, the Serbets river line that is under Ukrainian control in the north, and the Russian foothold across, which spans here to the west of Svatove. This is the Svatove part of it and the second part of it. This allows the Russians to launch two sort of operations. The first one is to consolidate their gains across the Serbets river line, which they gained over half a year ago, and have since been doing positional fighting where the Ukrainians are trying to push them back across the Serbets river line, and the Russians are holding on to their positions. In this section, the Russians are fighting heavily to keep their foothold. The third part is here by Stelmakhivka from Berestove and down to Andrivka, where the Ukrainians still hold positions across the Serbets river line in the eastern parts. This is a place where the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back to the river line and trying to gain control over the Stelmakhivka area. With this, the Russians would be able to develop offensive operations across the Serbs River line through the northern flank of it, similarly to the Liman area. By gaining control over the Serbs River line, the Russians can use it as a flank to concentrate forces in the north and push through to villages such as Peshane and Lozova and in the western direction. The main focus of the Ukrainians here is to hold on to their positions by Sinkove, while in the south it is Borova, north it is Kupiansk, and south it is Liman. So in this section of the front line, the Russians are attempting to gain control over the Serbs River line, where over the past few weeks, the Russians have gained control over Andrivka and Mieso-Sherivka, and in this area, they have also recently, today, pushed in the direction of Stelmakhivka, reaching the outskirts of it and gaining a foothold in the southern parts of it. With this, Russians have significantly improved their positions here to the east of the Serbs River line in the northern parts of it, and are reaching the final village of the Ukrainians still under their control along the northern parts of it. If the Russians gain control over Stelmakhivka, they will have gained control over the northern parts of the Serbs River line, and they will significantly improve the Russian positions here in the north, which brings us to the final part of this section of the front line, which is the Kupiansk section of it, where the Ukrainians have their focus around Kupiansk, Petropavlivka, Sinkivka to the north, and they used to have a focus around Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. However, the Russians in the last month captured both Kislivka and Kotlyarivka and have recently expanded their control to also gain control over Tabaivka and to the north of it. This has allowed the Russians to significantly improve their positions here and will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in the north, where we see that the Russians have broken through some of the Ukrainian defensive positions east of Sinkivka, reaching the river line north of Petropavlivka. In the northern parts by the Kupiansk section of the front line, we see two areas of heavy fighting and then an area here to the east. In the northern parts, we see in the direction of Sinkivka and the forest area. Here, the Russians have attempted to gain control over Sinkivka for over a year and have so far failed to do so. They have multiple times gained a foothold, but were every time pushed out of the village. This is due to heavy Ukrainian artillery and FPV drones within the village and constantly sending armored vehicles to prevent Russian infantry from gaining a foothold within the village. At the same time, the Russians had a corrupt general commanding the soldiers in Sinkivka. He was then fired. Following that, the Russians made a successful foothold within the village, but he also failed to consolidate those positions. The main reason for that is the Ukrainian control over the forest area west of the village, which allows for direct communication and contact between the Ukrainian soldiers within the village and the forest area, meaning that the Russians were unable to cut off the supplies and weaken the Ukrainian positions within the village due to the forest area supporting the Ukrainian positions there. Therefore, the Russians are forced to gain control over the Sinkivka area, the forest area, before they can actually gain control over the village, and this is why we're seeing the main focus of the Russians along the forest area. At the same time, the Russians have started a new front, which is here along the east of Sinkivka, where they're now pushing along the forest lines. If the Russians manage to gain control over this river line to the east, they will improve their positions east of Sinkivka and cut off the main road completely from supplies. This will force the Ukrainians to focus entirely on the forest area. If the Russians have success in the forest area as well, Sinkivka would be completely cut off and it would be forced to withdraw from the village, otherwise they would be completely encircled. Therefore, the Russians are going a roundabout way to gain control over Sinkivka rather than directly assaulting it due to the failures of direct assaults of the village. Gaining control over Sinkivka will allow the Russians to have direct fire control over Kupiansk and Petropavlivka. Having direct fire control over both of these settlements will significantly improve the Russian positions in the area, as will make it difficult for the Ukrainians to build up troops in the area and will allow the Russians to heavily grind down the Ukrainian forces. There's currently a lot of Russian artillery hitting Kupiansk and Petropavlivka around the clock. However, without direct fire, it is limited what sort of effect it can have. It has so far allowed the Russians to consistently be on the offensive and have the advantage in this area, but the Ukrainians have still been able to hold back any Russian breakthrough and has prevented the Russians from capturing Sinkivka for a very long time. However, this has also forced the Ukrainians to relocate a lot of their forces to this northern part of the front line to prevent a Russian breakthrough, as a Russian capture of Kupiansk could significantly improve the Russian position in the north and allow them to push down along the Oskil River line. This is currently the wall between the Ukrainian positions and the Russians in the north. A Russian breakthrough in the north will allow them to move along the Oskil River line, move down south to Sinkove, which will significantly limit the Ukrainian supply across the Oskil River line in the north, and will improve the Russian positions there. Now that the Russians have captured most of the villages east of the Oskil River line, east of Kupiansk, they'll be able to push along the eastern parts towards the Oskil River line to the south, which will limit the Ukrainian positions in the north and significantly improve the Russian positions there. The Russian and Ukrainian positions is at a deadlock in the north, and this is why the Russians are searching for additional areas where they can break through the front and get it moving again. And this is why we see the main fighting taking place by Stelmakhivka. A capture of that will allow the Russians to push towards Sinkove, through Pishane, and through Stelmakhivka. All in all, the Ukrainian forces here in the east of the Oskil River line are very powerful, well defended, and well executed, while the Russians are struggling to push through this section of the front line. With months of positional fighting along the entirety of the front, they have improved their position and captured multiple villages. However, they are still far from major success, but most of the forming of the battlefield with this positional fighting is nearing its end. A Russian capture of Stelmakhivka will significantly improve the Russian positions along the entirety of the Luhansk-Kharkiv region. And finally, we see the area to the south, Makiivka, Nevsky, Ivanivka, Terny, Yampolivka, Sarishne, and Torske. This village chain in the southern parts of the Serbets River line will likely see a lot of fighting along those villages in the coming weeks and months. If Russians manage to gain control over those, they will have the entirety of the Serbets River line under their control, and the battle for the Oskil River line will begin. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.